welcome to the Northeast Georgia History Center Wednesday live cast. So I am Marie Walker. I am the Director of Education here at the Northeast Georgia History Center, and I am also a seamstress. I love sewing, and I focus mainly on doing historical costumes in a historically accurate way, or sometimes like a historically inspired, and then kind of going off and doing more fantastical, fantasy-esque things, which are all fun. But it's always good to know the basics and to do the basics of historical costuming, and also just basics of sewing for a variety of reasons. If you need to mend your own shirt or pants, or you want to hem something because it's a little bit too long, we're going to be talking about how to do stitches for all of those today. So I have a white handkerchief because we're just going to be practicing stitches today. We aren't necessarily going to be sewing anything. We are going to learn how to do several stitches that then you can use in your own projects. So I have a white handkerchief and I have blue thread. If we were actually doing a real sewing project, you would want your thread and your fabric to match, unless you were doing some type of decorative stitch where you want the stitching to show, like some type of embroidery. But for the most part, you want your fabric and your thread to match. But for demonstration purposes, it's way easier to see the thread if it is a different color. And then we have our sewing needle. So the difference between a needle and a pin is that a pin will have like a head to it, so it doesn't go through the fabric, where a needle, it has an eye on it. Here, let's see. I'm not sure, it's so tiny, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to focus on it. But a needle has an eye on it. Now I think this is a really interesting thing because this is a hand sewing needle. An interesting thing because hand sewing has kind of fallen out of favor, historically speaking, since the sewing machine came along, because sewing machine can do so many more stitches per second than a person hand stitching. But if you ever look at a sewing machine, the needle is like this, where the eye is actually at the bottom near the point, and then it'll go through the fabric like that. Where hand sewing, the eye is at the top, and you go through this way, with the point and the needle and the eye of the needle are separate. So just an interesting historical tidbit there, the difference between a sewing needle, that is a hand sewing needle, and a machine sewing needle. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to thread my needle. So that means I'm going to put this thread through the eye of my needle. Sometimes it likes to go faster than others. All right, there we are. So then I'm going to pull. So I like to thread my needle to where I know it can't come off. Some people, they just they kind of leave it hanging like a tail, like here. I don't like to do that because I'm always afraid that my tail is going to come out and then you have to rethread your needle. I like to do it to where I double over. So I take my tail and I go all the way down. Whoop, there we go. I just lost it. Curled up there. All right. So I'm going to be sewing along this edge of the handkerchief, showing you a stitch. So I'm going to make my thread just a little bit longer because I'm going to have to tie it off on both ends. So the length of my thread is just going to be a little bit longer than the handkerchief. All right, and then I will cut that off there. Perfect. And then I'm going to tie my ends together here to make a knot at the end of my thread. I'm going to knot it a couple times because you want to make sure your knot's big enough so it doesn't pull through the weave of your fabric, and this weave of this handkerchief looks a little bit big, which is great, but just means you need a bigger knot. Okay, so I have knotted off the ends. I now have a double strand of thread. I like this for a couple of reasons. One is that you can't pull the needle off of your thread now, and also now you have a double thickness of your thread, which makes it a little bit more sturdy than if it were single. So I like doing this way better. Yeah, So we're going to go ahead and we are going to do a nice stitch here. We are going to do the running stitch.
Heidi asks, do you always sew with a double thread?
Oh yes, pretty much. Unless I'm doing something, the question was, do I always sew with a doubled over thread? And the answer to that is almost always yes, unless I'm doing something very fine. But most of the time I want to make sure my clothing that I'm going to be making is going to be not easily undone if I'm going to spend time doing that. So I almost always sew with double over thread because most of the time the thread I use it's not super thick. Sometimes if you use like buttonhole thread or something like that where it's supposedly thicker because it's made for heavy use areas, I won't because that's just too thick. But if I'm always using like normal thread and I'm doing usually like seam stitches or anything that's not incredibly decorative, I will sew with doubled over thread. Yes. It is my personal preference. Okay, so we're now going to line up the edges of, so let's pretend, so this is, the handkerchief is already hemmed. So obviously the inside would be here. Would be the side that does not have a little hem stitch on that. This, I can tell that this was sewn by a machine because I can identify machine stitches versus hand stitches. And maybe after this you will too. So this is what a machine stitch looks like. It's very fine. It's almost one right after the other with almost no gap in between. You can tell this is white on white, so it's incredibly hard to see, and that's why we will be doing blue on white so you can see it much better. This does not look, there we are. So I'm going to be doing the running stitch to start out with. The running stitch, we're going to start on the bottom of the fabric here. I'm going to move this over so you can see. Alrighty. I'm going to be sewing these two layers together. I like to start from the bottom, and then we're going to pull up and pull our thread all the way through. I like to go about a finger's width apart here, and then, well, or you could do even like a little bit smaller. I would not go more than a finger's width apart. Usually I do about yay length. Running stitches, you don't necessarily have to do a particular length. You just don't want it to be too big because otherwise then you're basically doing like a basting stitch to gather something, which I might show a little bit later, but right now we're just going to do a running stitch. So you want them to be rather small, rather close together. So then I went down, and then I'm going to come back up about the same length and pull my thread all the way through. And then I'm going to go back down about the same length. I'm going to go from the top down to the bottom there and pull that all the way through. All right, then I'm going to come up from the bottom about the same length and pull up and all the way through. And then from the top, I will go down again about the same length apart, back and all the way through. So one of the defining traits of the running stitch is you are alternating what direction the needle is passing. So it passes up to the top and then passes down to the bottom. This is a stitch that you're going to be seeing on pretty much all seams. If it's just like a seam on the inside of a shirt or the inside of pretty much any garment, it's going to be a running stitch if it's hand sewn. That's because it's one of the most common sewing stitches that you will use in pretty much everything. And it's nice because it doesn't use that much thread. You're just going up and then down and up again. If you were really trying to do this in a hurry, you can make your stitches bigger, but a lot of times you'll see someone who's really good at or very practiced in the art of hand sewing will be doing this. And their hand stitches are very fine. And if this is going to be something that's not on the inside seam, that might be seen on the outside, well, then you might do your stitches closer together like this. So on the back side, they're tinier pricks. Oh, that got a little knot in there. We're going to fix that.
For our more advanced sewers in the audience, can you offer some historical context to the life of a sewing?
Ooh, yes. So what would the life of a seamstress be like? Depending on what era you're talking about, because we've had seamstresses going back to the beginning of time, it seems like, because we have always been wearing clothes for the most part. Let's see. I'm going to pick an era. Let's start with earliest, and then we'll work our way back, shall we? So a lot of famous seamstresses, or famous ideas of it, seamstresses that we think of perhaps in the industrial era, are seamstresses who were making like shirtwaists or something like that on sewing machines. They were not necessarily hand sewing. They were very much basically locked in a large room with their sewing machines and expected to make so many garments a day and reach their quotas. And a lot of these garment workers are treated quite terribly. One of the most well-known, perhaps tragic events of seamstresses being confined, and the event that was a turning point for changing these conditions was the shirtwaist triangle factory fire, where many women perished in the fire or jumped to their deaths to avoid being burned by flames at the turn of the early 1900s. It was right there at the turn of the century, and that actually spurred a lot of the industrial reforms that we had going forward for factory worker safety. Going back before that, when mid-Victorian, you're going to have a woman who's pretty much hand sewing something like I'm doing right here, like just sitting there doing a running stitch or a variety of different stitches. And all the dresses would be made by hand up into the, I would say about 1870s. You would really only have handmade dresses, especially for a lot of different people, depending on your social class and such. But if you were a woman in the 1860s, you might have a machine sewn dress, but you're more than likely going to have a hand sewn dress, because the sewing machine, as we know it, came about in about the 1840s. But of course, like all inventions, it starts out, it's super expensive, it's not widely accepted, and it's only until it gets mass produced and cheaper that everyday people can afford it and have one. So starting in the 1840s, you could have a machine sewn dress, and then ending in the 1900s, you only have machine sewn dress. And around 1870s, 1880s is where you might have a sewing machine in your own home. Singer becomes incredibly popular, perhaps due to copyright infringement of the actual person who made the sewing machine. Or, I don't know, there's a lot of people who claim to have made the sewing machine. Some people say that the sewing machine was invented as far back as the 1790s, and it was really used for leather but there's not really any proof of that to be exactly certain. And then also there is another French man in the 1830s who also invented a sewing machine that's not quite the same design as the one like we think of today when you automatically think of like an old sewing machine. But the tailors who were doing hand sewing in France saw the sewing machine as a threat to their livelihood, which it was, and went to the factory and destroyed all the sewing machines because they were so afraid that this would become such an infringement upon their livelihood that they would no longer be able to, well, have a job and feed their families. And therefore, in the 1840s, when that sewing machine, the one that we kind of know of, like the grandparent of the one we know today, came about, it's hard to imagine a sewing machine as controversial, but perhaps it was in a sense because it's a machine taking over a job that was used to be done by hand, which we have. I guess we still have some of that today when people, with all of our computer automated things, but it was going on in the 1800s too.
All right, can you show the stitch that you're doing again for people who are
yes, so if you are just tuning in, we are doing a running stitch. So a running stitch, we started on the back here with our secured knot, and then we are going through, going up and down. We are the signature design or the signature kind of move of the running stitch is that it goes through each section and it does not cross back. So it goes back and forth to each side.
Will you be showing any stitches that are good for more advanced hand sewers?
Yes, we will be sewing. We're just going to start out with this stitch and then we will be going through a couple other stitches. So what we're going to do a few more running stitches and then we will transfer over and we will be doing a whip stitch.
I think we have a question.
Yes.
Have you done any hand quilting using the running stitch?
I have not done any hand quilting. I think quilting is absolutely beautiful, but I have not actually done any true quilting. That's something I would love to do at some point, but I have not quite gotten to that yet.
I think they want a closer look at the stitch. There we go.
Are we here? So this is what it looks like when you're doing it, or when you have completed some of it. There we go. Is that in focus there?
I think so.
All right, so I'm just going back and forth between each under and over of each side, back and forth, not crossing over. Now, here I'm just going to trim this and pull it out. If you're still practicing that, keep going. Or if you don't want to pull it out, you don't have to. I'm just going to cut that and pull it out so then we can go and we will do our whip stitch. So a whip stitch is great for finishing off pieces, or if you don't want it to be seen from the other side, sometimes this is a really good one to do if you want just like a little piece of it showing and you don't want the whole go through and have like a whole stitch. This would just be a little glimpse of the thread. I love the whip stitch because it's super fast and super easy to do. Here, let's move that to here. So whip stitch, again, we're going to start from the bottom, but then I'm going to go and I'm going to pull up. But unlike the running stitch, which goes directly down, we're going to pull this over and we're going to go from the bottom again. And it only comes through the bottom and then up inside here. So sometimes you have to, especially near the corner, you have to kind of coax it to where it pulls over. So this is over your raw edges here, or in this case, the finished edges. So we're going to go from the bottom again. So we all start from the same side. Always starts from the bottom, or just the same side. It doesn't have to necessarily be the bottom. I think it works better from the bottom. I think it's perhaps more correct if you do it from the bottom, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It just has to be the same side to get this effect.
I think I'll have a better view if I use this camera. So you can just let them know we're going to switch our cameras.
We are going to switch our cameras so that you can have a better view. So we will pause just for a moment.
So you can put the webcam to the side.
And we're going to put this here. And then we're just going to zoom in.
Yeah. Zooming in. Here we go.
So there we go. That's our whip stitch. So we're going to come under, and then you want your thread to be on the side closest to the next stitch, not the other side of the needle, otherwise it'll get all tangled.
Let's see, we have a question.
Yeah.
Letitia says her husband and her do mid-18th century. Are there any good references to use to research sewing techniques or practices for that time period, 18th century?
18th century. I believe that Burnley and Towbridge have a stitch. They sell a reprint of a stitcher's guide, like a seamstress's or tailor's guide to different stitches that they do in the 18th century, which is incredibly. I mean, it's everything an 18th century tailor or seamstress would want to know in terms of how to do different stitches. So I would highly recommend that. I believe, I don't know the exact title, but it's from Burnley and Towbridge on their website, and they do 18th century, 1700s different reprints of fabric and are incredibly interested in historical dressmaking practices and such. And on their website they have a book, and I don't know the exact name to it. I can't remember if it's like Tailor's Guide or Seamstress's Guide to 18th century stitches, but it is on their website, and it's a book that they sell, which has like,
oh yeah, here it is, The Workman's Guide to Tailoring Stitches and Techniques.
Yeah, so it's the official name, we have just looked it up, is The Workman's Guide to different stitches and techniques.
And just put a link in the...
And a link has just been put in the webcast.
Let's see. When you do the running stitch, do you ever put the needle through the top for more than one stitch?
So when you're doing a running stitch, no. Running stitch, you always put the needle, it's always passing through the different sides. So you would never come back and put it, that would be like a whip stitch. Because if you're going from the same side, that's a whip stitch, and then you would have it pull I just pricked myself. You would have, if you're coming from the same side, you're going to have a whip stitch, and it's going to be coming through the same side. And then it's going to go over your edge here, and it's going to look like this. And that's not what a running stitch would look like. That's what a whip stitch would look like. So again, for anyone who is possibly just tuning in, a whip stitch comes from the same side and always comes from the same side. You want the thread to stay over on the side that is closest to other threads. You don't want it to be like crossing your needle, because then it's going to get all tangled if you do it like that. So you want your thread on that side of the needle to pull up and come around to do a nice stitch there. So this is a whip stitch, kind of because you're just, you're whipping it. It's coming through. It's really fast. It's really easy to do once you get the hang of it. I'm going to do a couple fast ones here, just because you can see it's so fast and easy, because you're just coming from the same side, and it's so nice because it also kind of finishes your edge off here for you. You don't have to go back and perhaps finish it like you might have to do with a running stitch, because it kind of creates a nice, it finishes off your edges here, so they're not going to be of a particular problem. Oh no.
Georgiana wants to know, what's your favorite thing to sew?
Ooh, what's my favorite thing to sew? I love sewing historical costumes. That's my absolute favorite. I love 1860s because hoop skirts are fun, and I like big floofy dresses. 18th century, like the Marie Antoinette style dresses, also super fun. I have not made as many of those, but I like them a lot. I just made my first one this year that I would consider to be like the true Marie Antoinette style robe a la Française with the big watteau pleats in the back. And I do some hand stitching on that as well. Most of the time I do machine stitching, and then I just finish off with hand stitching because it takes so long to hand sew an entire garment. But I have completed one of my first all hand sewn projects. I made an 1860s chemise that I used all of these stitches on that we will be showing you today. So, my thread got tangled. So sometimes if your thread gets tangled, I just kind of stick the needle through and pull it out a little bit, and then I re-pull it through, and then it'll work and it settles back down. Sometimes when you're doing like a double thread, like I'm doing here, one thread will get pulled more than the other. So sometimes you have to go back down and pull it out to make sure they're being even. But there, so that's like what a whip stitch looks like. Does anyone have any perhaps questions about the whip stitch, or need a more demonstration on how that is done?
I think we're good there.
All right, So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut this and pull it out, and then we're going to go to do a hem stitch. So a hem stitch would be used on the hem of the dress, imagine that, or a hem of a shirt, or a hem of, oh, I guess another good thing, I've never tried to pull a whip stitch out before, but apparently whip stitches, they will not pull out there because they are spiraled together. Yeah, we're just going to go to this side of the handkerchief. So whip stitches will, oh, okay, if you pull it from the bottom, which stitches will come out better. But we'll just go to the bottom of the handkerchief here. So to do a hem, you fold it over at least once. So the bottom edge here. So I don't have any pins. Usually you would put pins to hold down your hem, but we're just going to be doing a little bit of the hem here. I need to tie a knot in the end of my thread again.
Oh, they want to know your background and your training and
Oh,
sewing and everything.
My sewing story. That's the question that has been asked in the chat. So it's actually perhaps a fun little full circle story. Last night, my mom was going through some papers and found resolutions that I had made, like, you know, write down your New Year's resolutions type thing. And I had done that on a piece of paper. It said Marie's New Year's resolutions from 2009. And one of my resolutions was learn how to sew. And I guess I have definitely done that. I mean, I'm continuously learning new skills and new things about how to sew. If you know, never stop learning until you're dead. We are always continuously learning, but I have definitely learned the basics, I would like to think. And it's hard to sew and talk at the same time. So I'm going to talk and do the story a little bit. Then we'll do a hem stitch. So I went to a sewing summer camp with my cousin called Just So You Know, SEW. And that's where I learned the basics of how to machine sew. And I made like fun pillows and bags and all of those fun beginner projects that you do. I made one giant pillow that looked like a foot. It was a fun time. And then I loved the sewing camp so much that I decided to take sewing lessons throughout the school year. So each week I would go and I would learn I would pick a pattern about how to make something, and they gave us like a book. So this is like your pattern book that you sew through as you do these lessons, and they each teach you something new that you have to do. So I made that's when I started to make like clothes, like a skirt or like a shirt. And pajama pants and things like that. And then since I learned the basics of like how to read a pattern, how to cut out a pattern, how to assemble the pattern after you have cut it out, I got a pattern from Joann's, like a simplicity pattern, and I went to my mom. I was like, I want to make this princess dress for Halloween. And I was like, well, okay, let's see if we can do it. Because you have beginner patterns and then you have more advanced patterns. And looking back on it now, it's some simplicity patterns and butterick patterns and McCall patterns are like the big three patterns that you would think of when you go to Joann's or you go to Walmart to their sewing section, are much harder to do than just like the basic beginner patterns that I had been doing. But sometimes you just have to plunge in head first and go and do that project, and you learn by doing, and that's kind of what I did. I started out doing those patterns just mainly machine sewing, and then hand sewing is something that kind of developed later as I wanted to be more authentic to my technique in historical costuming. And I would find different patterns from different pattern companies that were perhaps more historically based and more historically accurate than some of the big three pattern companies. Some of the patterns from big three pattern companies are good if you're trying to get a historic look, and some are more historically inspired. You're like, that is vaguely Victorian, but it's not exact recreation from any particular decade.
We're also curious about your history background, your academic background, your certificates and all that.
Oh, we're asking a lot of questions about Marie today. That's that's fun. I can talk about myself if y'all want me to. So a question was asked about like my academic background. So I just graduated in May from the University of Georgia with a degree in history, a minor in theater, and then certificates in British and Irish studies, museum studies, and historic preservation, which we'll be learning more about if you're a digital member. We will be talking about some historic architecture on Friday, and I will be going through how to identify different old houses and their styles. So if you're not a digital member, go ahead and do that, because I love talking about old buildings almost as much as I love talking about sewing. This has been a great week for me. I just get to talk about things I love doing. That's why I love my job so much. But that's what we'll be doing there. I studied abroad to complete my certificate in British and Irish Studies. To complete that certificate, you had to take at least one class in Britain or Ireland. So last summer, it was one of the best summers of my life, and because I got to study abroad at the University of Oxford, I took Institutions of the Medieval West and Romantic Era Literature at Christ Church College and Balliol College, respectively. I got to study in the Radcliffe camera, and it was my dream because I just got to read about history all day surrounded in pretty historical architecture, and it was fantastic. And if you want to hear more about that, we actually have a podcast where Glenn and I talk about our experiences abroad. Yeah, and abroad mainly in England and Ireland and the UK, because that's where I was last summer. And yeah, it was fantastic. So if you're interested in more about what that experience was like, you can go see our podcast, which I'm sure we will link in the chat as well. So that's me in a nutshell. That is my academic background in a nutshell. So we are going to now do the hem stitch. So this is perhaps one of the more advanced stitches that we're doing today. I'm going to have to hold it like this because I didn't bring any pins, but also it makes it so you can see it so easily. So a hem stitch, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do kind of like one stitch just to secure it on the bottom. So we're going to do it from the inside because we want to hide our thread from the outside as much as possible. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to do a nice secure just a stitch as tiny as possible on this end there. Now usually I do this when it's facing me, so I'm going to attempt to do it backwards so y'all can see it. So to do a hem stitch, here, I'm going to do it towards me just so I can configure it, and then I'm going to come back and I'll do it backwards. Because I think I might be, yeah. Okay. I'm doing it backwards, but it'll work. So I just did one hem stitch there. So a hem stitch is, to orient myself, so there's the back fabric here, and then there's like the fabric that is folded up to the hem. The fabric that is folded up on the hem, if you go through that, it's not going to do anything to hem it, so you're going to have to secure it to the back fabric here. You're going to take the tiniest of bites, like as small as you can get it from the back fabric, and then you're going to pull through the hem. And then it's going to create like a stitch right across the hem there. So again, we're going to go through the back. And we're going to take the tiniest of bites from the, I tried to get perhaps only like 1 or 2 fibers. But you also want it big enough to where it's not going to pull out in case you like step on it. So a small bite, as small as you can manage, as small as you think is going to be able to stay. And then you're going to push it through the hem there. So this is what it looks like from the front. And then this is what it looks like from the back. So you can see it's much tinier than on the front there. Or I guess this is the front and this is the back. So you want it to be as tiny as you can get it. And it kind of just looks like little pricks. So we're going to do a couple more of these. And this is very much kind of like the whip stitch in that you're always coming from the same direction. But it's also a little bit different because you're doing it on a hem and you're not doing it on a seam. a whip stitch you would be doing on like a seam around, and this is a hem, so the finished product looks a little different, but it's the same general idea.
Can you, one of our viewers needs help starting it again.
Oh, okay, so how to start the hem stitch. Oop. We're going to come back here. So you are going to stick your, pretend I haven't done any of this yet. So to start, you're going to put your needle through. All right, and then you're just going to kind of do a little prick of a stitch and come back up, so your needle is now secure, but you are also then ready to hem stitch. So you're just doing like the tiniest little stitch on the outside here, just kind of a down and then back up, get a couple fibers in there, and then you will be, your stitch is secure, and you are, it looks like this. So you're secure here, and you just have all your thread on the hem side of the fabric, and then you're ready to hem stitch. So from there, you are then going to come, because we're on the back with the hem that is visible, you're going to come through, you're going to do the tiniest of pricks of the fabric. So we're still starting on the back. The needle actually never passes all the way through to the front. It always stays on the back side here. It just catches a couple of the front fabric, then goes through the hem, and then you pull it through. So like the whip stitch, always stays on this side, but we're attaching the back of the fabric to the hem. So just the tiniest of bites. Oop. Dropping my needle. Tiniest of bites of the fabric, and then pull it through the hem. Oh, I'm so sorry. My finger was in the way. So tiniest of bites from the fabric into the hem.
Let's see, we have a question. I'm always trying to find books on textile history, not necessarily how to sew. Do you have any good recommendations on the history of wool, fibers, women's work, or fabric?
So are you talking about like the history of textiles specifically, or like fashion of like what people would, like styles of what people would wear?
History of wool, fibers, and women's work or fabric, specifically textiles.
So
yeah.
Specifically textiles. I can't think of any particular book that is dedicated to just textiles, specifically wool. Most of my research goes into the style of the dress that fabric would be put into, but there's always bits and pieces of the fabric information in those books. So I cannot speak to that specifically. Nothing directly comes to my mind. I can't think of anything that would particularly be exactly what you're looking for. Yeah, so we're just going to, I'm going to finish off this hem stitch. I am almost done with my blue thread here. I'm just going to finish this off. We're just going to take tiny little bites of the outside fabric and then push it through. And then we'll take a look at the back side and see how, all right, so just tiny little bites of the back side, and then push it through the hem. There we go. And then on the back side, it looks kind of like this. So it would be more spaced out than this, but then I went through to re-show what it would be like. So really, if this is kind of what it would look like. And if you have it as the same color, the same color thread as you would, if the thread matched the fabric, it would be even harder to tell that there were stitches because they're so tiny. That's the size of my finger there, and that's the size of the stitch. It looks big because we are zoomed in so far on them, but once we zoom farther out, it's harder to tell. Mm-hmm. Yeah, see, so if you zoom all the way far out, you can see how tiny the stitches really just are, and if they were the same color as the fabric, be even harder to decipher. All right, so are there any last questions on how to do a hem stitch if anyone had just confused, or are we good on that? Okay, cool. So I'm going to go ahead, I have to rethread my needle because I'm running out of thread. But then I will be showing perhaps them even more advanced of how to hand do a buttonhole. Here, I'm going to see if I can Nope. My stitches are too secure. Okay, that's just going to have to stay. We have at least one corner of the handkerchief left to do our buttonhole on. So I'm going to go ahead and rethread my needle. Sometimes you have to, if your thread gets a little, make sure it's nice and smooth so it threads easier. Or sometimes if you like twist the fibers together, it's better. I think I might have twisted my fibers the wrong way. There we go. Oh no. I created a knot already. There we are. Okay, so one of the most nerve-wracking things of doing a buttonhole is that you have to make a hole in your fabric.
Do we need a button for this? Someone asks.
Not to do a buttonhole, but to fill the hole of the button, you will need a button.
But not today.
But we're not going to be sewing on buttons today. We're just going to show you how to do the buttonhole. Perhaps next time we will show how to sew on a button for your buttonhole. All right, so I'm going to tie off the end of my thread here. Okay. So to do the buttonhole, first you have to make a hole. I'm going to make a very small buttonhole because I don't want to make it too big of ones because I want to show you how to do it. So I'm going to go in. How I like to make a buttonhole is usually I'll mark it out, or I'll mark out how big the button is. So the buttonhole that you would make would be very much dependent upon the button. I think you want it to be 1/8 of an inch larger than your button. So we're going to pretend I have a really small button. And then I like to cut buttonholes. I fold the fabric over on where I want, like if I wanted my buttonhole right here, I would fold my fabric over until the center of the buttonhole is on the center of the fold. And then I would gently snip that where I would want the buttonhole and however long I have it marked to be. And sometimes your scissors get dull and you have to go and, there we go. These are not fabric cutting scissors. All right, so then I have made a very small hole here for my small button. But that now means I have a bunch of these loose fibers everywhere. So I want to finish that off, finish the buttonhole off to be even better, so to hold that. So I have my needle and my thread. I have secured off the end of my thread with a knot. I'm going to start in the far corner of the buttonhole. So the farthest corner that I can get to, which is here. So if I put my needle all the way in the corner, that's as far as the hole is. I'm going to start from the underside. So here we are, here's the hole. I go in from the underside. I put my needle halfway through. My needle is now halfway through. And then I am going to take the end of my thread. I'm going to loop it around my needle. And then I'm going to pull, and I'm going to bring the tail down, and then I'm going to pull this through. Oh, well, okay. I guess I have to do a secure stitch first. I forgot about that. So I now have done a secure stitch. My thread's now secure. So pull that through first. Now stick your needle halfway in through. I got a little ahead of myself there. Stick your needle halfway through. You don't want it to go too far towards the top. You only want it to be just a little bit farther up than where your hole is. If you can see here, our hole is right here, and then our thread is right there. So maybe like a 1/6 or an 1/8 of an inch above where the hole is. So I have my needle halfway through. My thread is secured on the side in a loop here. I am then going to take, oh no, there we go. I'm going to take my needle. I'm going to loop it around my thread. So I've made a loop around my thread to create a knot as I pull my needle through. And then that creates a little knot there at the bottom of my hole for my buttonhole. So I'm going to do that. They don't have to be like super close together, but you want, because you want the knots to be pretty much lined up around the edge, but they don't have to be a specific, they don't have to be as close together as you might think for it to be a buttonhole, because if you're thinking about a tailor who has to do, you know, 20 of these at least on a jacket, they're going to be done quick. They're going to be done nicely and efficiently, but they're going to be done quick. They aren't going to spend 30 minutes on each section of a buttonhole on the top and the bottom. That would be like an hour per buttonhole. That means you would spend 20 hours of a day doing 20 different buttons on a jacket, which is impractical. So they don't have to be as close together as you might think, but you want them to be fairly close together. All right, so now you can kind of see that there's like a little knot at the bottom of this hole. So again, I'm going from the bottom. We're going to go from the bottom each time. So you go through the buttonhole from the bottom to the top. So through the buttonhole, go up about 1/6 of an inch from the buttonhole, put half of your needle through, take that tail of your fabric, take the tail of your thread, loop it around the needle. Oh no, my needle came off. Okay, well, we're going to do that again then. So through the buttonhole, halfway through. So through the bottom of the buttonhole, put your needle halfway through, take that end of your thread, loop it around that needle, that top of that needle, and pull it all the way through. There you can just see it formed a knot at the bottom.
Similar to a blanket stitch.
So through the bottom and up. So through the bottom of the buttonhole, halfway through, take that end of your thread, loop it around the half of the needle that's up through the button, and then pull it all the way through. I'm going to do these, a couple more of these, and then you'll see a little bit of a buttonhole taking shape there. So through the bottom of, so here we go, through the bottom of the buttonhole, coming up to the top.
Question. Would you do any reinforcement of your cut edge first?
So the question was, would you do any reinforcement of your cut edge? I mean, if you wanted to do a running stitch around, you could, but I don't see necessarily a point to. You're creating a knot. You're creating like a whole series of knots around the end of your entire buttonhole. And according to, I believe, the Victorian Tailor's Guide, this is how they would do it, and they would not put any reinforcement in. That's not to say that if you decide you want to, you certainly could, but I do not think it is necessary to. I have done several buttonholes like this, and I have not had any problems with the buttonholes coming out for any particular reason. All right, so we have a buttonhole taking shape. And it kind of looks, it's very different than what you would think a machine stitch buttonhole would look like. It's not as tight and not as many threads as we're used to. So from the bottom halfway through, take your thread and loop it over, then pull it all the way. Oh, you don't want to get a knot before you're ready. All right, then pull it through. All right, well, I got a big knot there. I'm going to pick out that knot. So you can see the buttonhole, it does not look like what we would expect a buttonhole to look like. That's kind of like what the buttonhole looks like. You have some stitches that are not nearly as close together as you would think, but here you can kind of see the knot that stretches over between the button, between the two stitches. So that's like going to be that's what's going to be lining your entire buttonhole, is these stitches here, and that's what really matters. The stitches that come up here don't matter as much. What really is going to hold your buttonhole from unraveling is those stitches that are across here that are formed when we loop the thread around the needle, and that's what you're going to be doing. And that's what really matters, is those little knots on the actual buttonhole. The stitches around it don't really matter that much. They're just kind of there to hold these little knots in place, and therefore they're not as close or next to each other as one might think of a modern buttonhole might be. So yeah, they look a little different. This fabric also has a really large weave, so it's fraying. It's not handkerchief is this handkerchief is not meant to be have buttonholes made into it. So that's also something that you might think of. What kind of fabric is good for what you're doing? If you're doing a more utilitarian, like outfit, jacket, something that you know is going to be receiving a lot of wear and tear, you're going to probably want a thicker weave to that fabric. You're not going to be using like a fine linen to do your work jacket out of, because the fibers are not going to hold together as well. Also, you might think of that if you're going to do any type of buttonhole. How close of the weave is your fabric together? The closer the weave is, the easier it is going to be, the less likely it is to unravel in any given circumstance, including doing a buttonhole.
I have a question. Are you planning to show how to mend a rip in a garment? They joined late.
So today we have gone through a running stitch, a whip stitch, a hem stitch, and how to hand do a buttonhole. So those are the 4 stitches that we have done today for this sewing lesson, and we might be doing another one at some point where we will go over more fun sewing techniques and such, but those are the only 4 that we will be doing today.
Okay, and we're at 2:55. Do you want to go ahead and show the video, or is there another one?
Oh, nope. So we have just done the 4 stitches that we have done today. So, and if anyone has any questions, we have just a few minutes left of this broadcast going. So
But we are going to show you video.
But we are going to show a video about how you would use all of these stitches in an actual garment that I have made, that I have made in the past, that we will be showing a video about how my making process of that garment.
Very cool. So if you want to conclude and
all right, so that is it for our sewing lesson today. I hope you enjoyed learning how to do some of these different fun historical stitches. We are about to go see a video of an 1860s chemise that I made a couple months back at the beginning of quarantine. It was my quarantine project, was to learn. I actually had time to hand sew everything, because usually I do a machine to sew just because it's so much faster. But it was so nice to relax and to do all these hand stitches that I finally had time to do, and to really take in the joy of hand sewing. And we're going to be seeing all of the stitches that I showed you today and how they would come to be used in an actual garment that you would be making in a historical way from the 1860s. So without further ado, that video is going to start playing now.
Hello! Long time no sewing vlog, as it seems happens sometimes. Hello! Long time no sewing vlog, as it seems happens sometimes. It's kind of been a crazy time, so how is everyone doing? I hope everyone's staying healthy and safe and all that, because it's a weird time, and you know, it really took me a while to start sewing a project during this time, because I kind of just went into survival mode, and it's hard to create when you're just trying to survive. So if you saw my Instagram post a while back now, almost a month ago, you know my sewing plans changed slightly drastically, because I was winging my next project that I already had fabric for and was literally about to start cutting out that day that I posted it, was my formal dress, and then it got cancelled because of everything going on. So I didn't really know what else to sew, so I went to my fabric stash, because I'm not going to the fabric store here, and I found some pretty white linen, and I decided to make a chemise, an 1860s chemise, because the one that I have that I made a long time ago, it's pretty nasty and has sweat stains all over it from reenacting down south. So I decided to go ahead and make it myself a new 1860s chemise that will work it'll work really 1850s and maybe 1840s if I fudge it really good. But yeah, so it's very much a mid-Victorian chemise. And since I have a lot of time, because my school was canceled for, like, completely canceled for 2 weeks, while they sorted out what to do, I decided I was going to hand sew it, because that seemed like a good idea. Because I like hand sewing, I just don't normally have time to do it, because hand sewing is way more time consuming than machine sewing. So I decided to hand stitch it, which was challenging in its own way, because I haven't, usually if I do hand stitching on things, I don't think I've ever completely hand sewn like a garment before. I usually do like a mixture of hand stitching and machine stitching. And if you don't have time to hand sew everything, but you still want to participate in a hobby, I don't think that you not having time to hand sew everything should keep you away from it. Because if I couldn't machine sew my things, I wouldn't have like any outfits. I might have one, and creating things brings me joy, and therefore I'm going to do it. So that is my personal take on that. With that being said, I think there's beauty in hand stitching as well as machine sewing, and I had to look up a lot of things while I was doing a lot of hand stitching that we'll get into a little later, because I'll show you what I did. Because there are certain stitches you use for certain parts of the garment, and then certain ways of doing everything. It's not just one straight stitch. So we'll talk about that more later. But the first thing I did, of course, was cut out the pattern, and I got myself to do that. So that was a good step one, is getting myself to cut out the pattern. I used a period impressions pattern. It worked really, really well. I liked it a lot. I was thinking about doing a video about some of my favorite historical pattern companies. So if you are interested in that, tell me that you are interested in the comments, and I will work on a video about that. But yes, so cutting out period impressions pattern, step one. Step two was cutting out the fabric. And I used this kind of white linen I'm pretty sure it's linen. Like I said, it's from my fabric stash, and I don't label things. So, it feels nice, and I do a lot of things by feel. I can just like feel a fabric and I'm like, yes, this would be good for the mid-Victorian era, or no, this doesn't feel right, or it's passable. Because sometimes things don't have to be 100% authentic, and that's okay. But sometimes they do need to be 100% authentic, and that is also okay. So, depends on what event you're going to and what your purposes of making these things are. So, I did that. And then I started to stitch. And I got my needle and my thread, and I threaded the needle, and then I decided we're going to start with the yoke that goes around your shoulders. That's a pretty good start to this, I think. I began by sewing the outer shoulder band to its lining. I opted not to do a drawstring option. I sewed them together using a running stitch, or a straight stitch, as it's sometimes called, which is probably the most basic stitch in hand sewing. The stitches worked by passing the needle in and out of the fabric from one side to the other, and then back again. I draped it over my shoulders to make sure it would fit, and I was quite pleased. Something I learned after getting into historical costuming is that I have sloped shoulders, which seemed to be incredibly popular during the 19th century. It's depicted in a lot of paintings, especially during the 1830s. Like, just look at that slope. Anywho, I find it to be incredibly helpful to keep this in mind while working on something like this chemise, because it sits on or just below the shoulder. So to know if you have like normal shoulders or like broad shoulders or sloped shoulders, it's helpful to keep that in mind when making something like this. It was then time to make the little slit in the front panel of the chemise. I made nice little tiny hems on either side of that slit, and I sewed them down using a running stitch. The pattern then said to make a 5/8 pleat, which brings the right side over the left front edge, but here I accidentally pleated the left over the right, so I had to seam rip it and fold it over the right way, which I did later. But of course, those of you who are watching the video right now, it does look like I put the right over the left like I'm supposed to do, and for me staring at the garment, that's also what I thought, but then I put it on and I realized it was wrong. Anywho, this is the wrong way that I was doing it, but it still gives you an idea of how I did it. Just pretend it's the mirror image. After that, I marked the pleats on the front of the chemise and I pinned them in place. For the back, I decided not to do pleats, and I did a gather in the center back. I then sewed the front of the shoulder band to the chemise front and back panels with a running stitch. Once I was done, I pressed the neckband flat. I tried it on just to make sure it was fitting properly and was, again, very pleased with the progress. It was then time to work on the sleeve. I did a narrow rolled hem on the short edge of the sleeve piece. To sew this rolled hem in place, I used a hem stitch that I learned how to do from a video by Burnley and Towbridge. I will be linking that down in the description box below if you would like to learn more about that. It's very informational and very helpful. Good video. But I will summarize it here very quickly. So basically, you prick as little of the top fabric as possible while still securing the stitch, and then you take it from the back into the hem, and then you work it from the back. Again, if you want more detail, go see the link by Burnley and Towbridge once you are done with this video. I then gathered the tops of the sleeves. I later realized that I gathered these sleeves far too tightly, and I went back and I seam ripped them and I gathered them less. But I did it the same way as I did it here. Just imagine it with less gathers, because that's how it's going to be when it's done. After gathering the sleeves, I set the sleeves into the shimmies. But the way that this pattern called for the sleeves to be set was in two parts. First, you were to just sew the top gathered part of the sleeve to the chemise, and then you were to sew up the chemise side seam and then out the bottom of the sleeve. So I sewed the sleeve in these two parts. I sewed in the top of the sleeve, and then I sewed up the side seam and out the bottom of the sleeve using a running stitch. Here is my furry little sewing helper who is absolutely loving having me home so much. She also really loves to watch me hand sew. She doesn't really care about watching the machine, like the sewing machine. Only she really loves watching hand stitches. This is not the first time she's done this. I believe it's when I was sewing the Watteau, yes, the pleats. And my robot La France, she also did the same thing. She's adorable, and I love her, and she's just so cute and so helpful. I really think it has something to do with the thread, but because she loves to play with string. But she never tries to bat or play with the thread, so I think she knows that this isn't a play toy. But she just really likes to watch it. So after sewing the side seams, I finish it off nicely by doing a flat felled seam. I don't normally take the time to finish off my garments in the most proper of ways, but like I said, I had a lot of time on my hands, so I decided to make this really nice. To make a flat felled seam, you cut one side of the seam allowance to about 1/4 of an inch, and then you fold over the longer seam allowance, and you fold the longer over the shorter, and then you stitch it flat. I then finished off the shoulder band. To do this, I turned the raw edge of the inside of the band under, and then I whip stitched over the seam allowance to finish it. A whip stitch is when you sew through both layers of fabric, but you start each stitch from the same side, and you generally sew very close to the edge of the fabric. I then hemmed the bottom of the chemise. I did a double fold hem, and I used a hem stitch to sew it down, the same as the one I used above that I learned from Burnley and Towbridge. Lastly, I had to sew on a button and make a buttonhole. So a buttonhole is recommended to be about 1/8 of an inch longer or larger than the button. Here I am measuring that out, marking the measurement onto the fabric, and then making the cut. To make the cut, I folded the fabric in half over the line I wanted to cut, so then I can snip the middle part, and then from the middle of the buttonhole I can snip out the edges. I finished off the buttonhole by hand using the fabulous video by Bernadette Banner about, well, making buttonholes. I will link that video below as well if you would like more detailed explanation. But in a nutshell, you start on the inside of the buttonhole, then you stick the needle halfway through, you then bring the tail of the thread over the needle and pull that needle the rest of the way through, and this makes a little knot on the inside of your buttonhole to hold everything together. Again, if you would like a more detailed explanation, go see the fabulous video by Bernadette Banner, linked below. Once the buttonhole was done, I placed the button and I sewed it down. And then finally, it was done. I think hand sewing is a really wonderful skill, and I think I might even use it more and more in the future because I liked it more than I thought I did. And it was really helpful during this time to just sit and work on something with my hands that was very slow and methodical and very soothing in a way, which I enjoyed. But I'm incredibly proud of this work that I did here on this chemise, and I can't wait to wear it. Hopefully not all reenacting events are going to be cancelled. Of course, we'll have to see what we can do safely, because safety is the #1 priority. But yes, or if I can't wear it to an event, I'm just going to wear it around my house, so it'll be fine. Alright, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. This has been a Historical Belle production. If you liked it, I do a lot of these type of things, so hit that like and subscribe button. And yeah, I think that's it. I have some more content coming out in the next couple weeks, so stay tuned. Alright, thanks.